Coming up, will D'Angelo Russell be back in the black and white with the Brooklyn Nets next season? And where do the Nets stand as the tank race heats up with about 17 games remaining? I'll get to all that and more after this. What is up, Nets world? We're back here on the Believe in Nets podcast on the Believe Podcast Network. I'm your host, Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. And before we get into anything, if you do not already, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA, subscribe to this channel, like it, comment, anything you guys can do to engage. That second you take to hit the like button, that second you take to leave a comment, it really helps to grow the channel and drive the algorithm and engagement on these videos. And I also just love hearing from you guys what you think about the net situation, what you think about my work, and entering a conversation on anything, regarding those things. So if you can do that, I really appreciate it. But on today's episode, I'm going to have Mike Scotto of HoopsHype and national NBA insider and a friend of the pod who always has his finger on the pulse of what's going on with the Brooklyn Nets. We're going to be talking about D'Angelo Russell, some comments that D'Angelo recently made about wanting to come back to the Nets, and the prospects of him returning, what a deal could look like, pros of it, cons of it, predictions on what's going to happen. We got on all that. It was a really good talk with Scotto. But before that, just want to give a little update on where the Nets stand. I think we have about 17 games remaining in the regular season, and the tank race is really heating up where the Nets are at. So the Nets picked up a win on Monday over the Los Angeles Lakers, snapping a 7-game losing streak, and they nearly picked up another upset win on Tuesday against the Cleveland Cavaliers. They're up by, I think it was 17 or 18 points in the third quarter, and then collapsed down the stretch. But following those two losses, the Nets are really in a race with two teams, the Toronto Raptors and the Philadelphia 76ers. And based on how the draft lottery standings have shook out, 5, 6, 7, those are the slots and the Nets are battling for with Toronto and Philadelphia. And the tank race is really heating up, and the 76ers and the Raptors are really going for it. I touched on it briefly with Scotto, but a recent game with the 76ers, they played the Orlando Magic. They rested, I think, all of their 4 or 5 of their starters the last 6, 7 minutes of the game, clearly trying to get a loss. They pulled out a win on a miracle 3 by a rookie. I forgot his name, but that's, giving you a sense of the direction of where the Raptors are heading. And the 76ers, even more so, have every incentive to try to keep their draft pick, try to stay ahead of the Nets because they owe their pick top 6 protected to the Oklahoma City Thunder. So they're going to be doing everything they can to stay in those top 6. They last night beat the Toronto Raptors, which was an ultimate tank-off game where both teams were resting multiple guys. The 76ers already shut down Joel Embiid for the season, but they rested Tyrese Maxey, Paul George, Gershon Yabusele. All these guys were out during that game. The Raptors, Emmanuel Quickly, Grady Dick, Scotty Barnes, all those guys were out. And the 76ers were able to come away with a loss, which brought them into a tie with the Nets for 5th place in the draft lottery standings. Just going to pull the standings up real quick so you guys can see. So as you see here, Nets are tied with the 76ers in that 5th slot. They both have the exact same winning percentage. The Raptors are a half game behind. And as I said, it's that 5, 6, 7. Those are really the spots that the Nets are battling for and jockeying for position for right now. So you can see how the lottery odds change in those spots. And the 76ers and the Raptors are taking stretches and measures to try to maximize their chances of those things. And the Nets, up to this point, have not really done it. They've sat some guys recently, like they sat Trendon Watford and Cam Thomas for, their last 2 back-to-backs, but that was due to hamstring injury management. And I actually believe that that's a legitimate injury management because both of those guys have missed extended stretches due to hamstring strains earlier this season. So it makes sense. They sat D'Angelo Russell against Cleveland on Tuesday on the second night of a back-to-back because he recently missed time with an ankle injury, but that was due to injury management. But in terms of holding veterans and guys out, whether it be Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, whoever else you want to say, those guys are playing on a nightly basis if they're healthy, and they have been lately in terms of in-game adjustments of benching guys like a D'Angelo Russell or a Cam Thomas or a Nick Claxton or a Cam Johnson, whoever down the stretch of games. The Nets have shown no willingness to do that. So up to this point, they're jockeying for that position, that 5, 6, 7 position. The teams that they're playing against have shown clear signals of really, being incentivized and willing to take these steps and measures to try to finish ahead of the Nets and maximize their draft pick. Up to this point, the Nets have rested some guys, but they really haven't been at the level of those other teams, and they haven't shown any indication that they're going to, pivot and take that trajectory with over the final 17 games of the regular season. Could they? It's not out of the question, but we have no evidence up to this point that that is going to be the case. And these guys, these veterans, whether it be D'Lo, whether it be Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, Cam Thomas, the whole team is playing extremely hard, and they all clearly want to win. Cam Johnson was clearly pissed after this loss on Tuesday, so they're going to keep playing hard. They've been playing hard regardless of competition. They've been able to hang early on with a lot of really good teams and even come away with the win while it was a shorthanded Lakers team over Los Angeles on Monday. So we'll see. Everybody's going to be monitoring the draft lottery standings over these final 17 games. The Nets have really fallen out of that play-in race. They're going to play the Chicago Bulls, who are the team in that 10th spot right now, but they're about 4.5 games behind them. It doesn't seem like they're going to be able to catch up to that. So the attention is really fully shifted towards the draft lottery standings, and we'll see if the Nets change their course and are willing to take some measures to try to finish ahead of the 76ers or the Raptors. And I'll have coverage of all of that more, obviously, on Clutch Points and here on Believe in Nets, but want to get to the talk with Scotto about D'Angelo Russell's future. I think we touched on a lot of interesting stuff, so hope you guys really enjoy that after a quick break. And I'm joined now by HoopsHype's Michael Scotto, friend of the pod, a recurring guest here on Believe in Nets. And Scotto, we are here today talking about D'Angelo Russell and his potential future with the Brooklyn Nets. Will the Nets potentially look to bring him back? And there's been some reports, some noise about this lately from you. Also, our colleague Brian Lewis had a report, but you spoke to D'Angelo exclusively recently. You touched on potentially the prospect of him returning to the Nets. Just what did he have to say to you? And then we'll get into kind of the details of what it could look like moving forward.
Yeah, Erik, happy to be on with you. Always a pleasure. And yeah, for D'Angelo Russell, I caught up with him the other day after the game, and there obviously had been some speculation about what would his future be going into the summer with him being an unrestricted free agent. And after beating the Lakers, his former team, he was obviously in a pretty jovial mood. And I just went up to him and we were talking a little bit about how he's adjusted with Jordi Fernandez, how he's appreciated his belief in him and having him in the starting lineup and kind of giving him the keys to the offense to be a playmaker as opposed to just a shot maker in his words. And looking ahead towards the future, how Jordi and Kenny Atkinson compare and contrast to each other. But the big lead was that D'Angelo told me that he would love to re-sign with the Nets this summer. And I think certainly given Brooklyn's got a ton of cap space looking ahead, and we'll have to see what happens with the draft lottery and where they end up picking. There's a long way to go here. But for his intentions, he would like to re-sign with the Brooklyn Nets. So we'll see if it happens.
All right, yeah. So I want to get into why that is the case, what it could look like, the case for it, the case against it. We're going to touch on all of that. But I think it's important to just outline, obviously, D'Angelo comes over in the trade from the Los Angeles Lakers that sent Dorian Finney-Smith there, and they got back D'Lo. The Nets got back D'Lo and 3 second-round picks. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't so much of the Nets targeting D'Angelo Russell as it seemed like they were prioritizing getting draft picks and getting expiring contracts. And, getting D'Lo's expiring contract would, if they want to, if they don't bring him back, would add to their cap space this summer, was leading the league by far. They're the only team with cap space or significant cap space around, $55 to $65 million. So there has been a question of whether they potentially look to bring D'Angelo back. And everything from D'Angelo's end since he came in that trade has spoken glowingly about the Nets, about what it was like when he was first here, what it's like now, Jordi Fernandez, how they've utilized him, saying that he'll never take it for granted, being able to play free basketball the way the Nets have allowed him to, never take it for granted again. And that has led to these questions recently of, will the Nets look to bring him back? And there has been confirmation, obviously, from his end, as you just outlined, that he does want to be back, and it's something that he's very open to. So touching on why he wants to come back to the Nets and what the incentive is there. as we just touched on, the Nets are the only team with cap space. The Pistons and the Jazz are the two other teams who could have space, but it's looking unlikely based on several factors there. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that neither of those teams would be using that space on Russell if they were to open it up. And then, so if he hits unrestricted free agency, he's looking at teams with the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So that would mean about $14 million per year max offer. That's the most that teams would be able to give to him in a deal. And I'm not sure how many teams are going to be, looking to spend the whole non-taxpayer mid-level exception on D'Lo. So when you're evaluating him and his potential prospects in free agency, does it kind of appear like it's really just the Nets or bust in terms of him being able to get a sizable contract for multiple years?
Well, I mean, you pretty much outlined it. If he's not going to go with the Nets, there are a few cap space teams available right now. So you'd be looking at closer to a non-taxpayer mid-level. But for the Nets, and I think for D'Lo, he's done situations where he's done a short-term deal, whether it's with a 1+1 team option, something like that. Maybe there's a partial guarantee, who knows. I think for the Nets, they have a ton of money to spend, and it's going to be interesting to see how they utilize it. Are they acquiring a star who's maybe a max guy in a trade and absorbing it into some of that cap space? They have to figure out Cam Thomas's restricted free agency, which is one of the most polarizing conversation topics in the league, because depending on what executive you talk to, his number is all over the place. And again, similar to D'Lo, the Nets have the cap space and they have restricted free agency rights on Cam Thomas. So they have a ton of leverage there on paper. So for D'Angelo, the biggest thing about the Brooklyn Nets for D'Angelo is he's just loved the atmosphere. He stressed to me the importance with them of it's all about the team. You win and lose as a team. I'm sure in other stops, maybe he felt a little bit more like a scapegoat in a sense. And obviously with the playoffs previously with the Lakers, if he wasn't making shots, he wasn't on the floor. Whereas here in Brooklyn, as he touched on in my interview with him on HoopsHype, if he wasn't making shots, he's still being trusted by Jordi Fernandez to be a playmaker, be a point guard on the floor and set other guys up, which his passing is a strong suit of his game.
Did he use the word traumatized in his quote to you? Am I remembering that correctly? And he's saying that in regard to his experience with the Lakers, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that gives you obviously gives readers and fans a little bit of a glimpse into how D'Lo felt about what happened there in LA. I think people remember earlier this season, there was the viral clip of him taking the corner three or, a step back three or something along those lines. And JJ Redick is literally like on the bench, just like slamming a chair into the ground. And then they took him out of the starting lineup the following game. And then not too long after that, he actually played pretty well coming off the bench for a little bit. And not too long after that, they make the trade from him to the Nets. And then the comment, since he came into this new role, as I said earlier, was, I'll never take for granted being able to play free basketball like this again. So that's been a recurring theme from a lot of the Nets players in terms of, the coaching staff, people aren't walking on eggshells, players, in terms of the shots they're taking and things they're doing along those lines. The coaches have been clear and strict about, what they want and the shot diet, but they're not putting handcuffs on any of these guys. And that seems like it's been really appealing to D'Lo, obviously.
Oh, no question, but it's also a different situation. The Lakers are trying to compete
obviously
in the playoffs, strive for what at the time they wanted to be a championship team. With the Nets, it's more about a focus on player development and looking ahead towards the future, seeing which players on the roster are going to remain core players of the organization going forward as they strive to incrementally improve.
Yeah, and before we're going to get into what potentially, if he does come back to the Nets, what the contract could look like, our kind of feelings, case for it, case against it. Do we think it'll happen? But just talking about him wanting to come back to the Nets and him potentially kind of, surveying his potential options in free agency, which we said as probably would be those taxpayer mid-level exception teams, a lot of which are looking to contend. And if you're going to be bringing in a guy like D'Lo who's 28 years old, you're, making that move to look to contend potentially. You're not bringing him in if you're a rebuilding team.
Right.
And I think it brings up an interesting conversation of just what is D'Lo as a player, like as an archetype of a guy that a contending team is looking to bring in. How are teams valuing him? Because he's kind of in this weird situation of, early in his career, obviously made the All-Star team with the Nets. He was a high usage lead guy and was very successful in that role. But as his career has progressed, it's become clear that he's not, he's a role player. He's not a lead ball handler on a, championship level team. He's not a number 2 guy. He's a surrounding piece who could be in a rotation for sure, but it gets kind of confusing when you're that guy who's best with the ball in his hands. Your skills are, things that you can do as a pick and roll ball handler and a lead guy, but you're an undersized guard. You're not necessarily known for your defense. How do those guys fit as potential, starters on a contending type of team? And that's obviously the conversation that the Lakers front office was having there. And I think that it could be an impact of, it obviously will impact what his market looks like if he's looking at what it would be outside of the Nets.
Yeah, look, for D'Angelo, he thrives as a ball handler. I still think he's a good passer. We've seen plenty of times on the Nets when he's throwing these backdoor one-handed passes behind the defense. Off ball, he's an effective catch and shoot 3-point shooter. So
he has been throughout his career, not this year, but it seems like an outlier year.
I always tend to, when I throw a scouting report, I go to the regression to the mean. For the most part of his career, he's been a pretty good shooter off ball. And I would say for D'Lo and how teams value him, well, he even touched on it in the interview that he's not going to drop 20-something points a game. Like that's not going to be what's asked of him. He just wants to contribute to winning. So I do think he's got a role on teams. Even when you look at the Nets, it's funny because fans were saying, well, we got this guy now, but he might actually help the team win, when some fans would rather they focus on player development and a draft pick. So I still think he's got some years left ahead of him for sure. I think it's just a question of, the other thing is like, well, does a team maybe do a sign and trade for him? There's a lot of different avenues for him to go. We haven't even hit the lottery yet. It's still very early for that. But theoretically, if he was going to return to the Nets, for example, I would think it would be something short, maybe a 1+1, where, it's flexible for both him and the team. And he's also then equally still a trade asset, not only because of what he can bring on the court, but his contract as well.
Yeah, and that's before we get into projections of what the contract could look like, just along the lines of what I was saying. You said that you think that he still has a role, on a contending level team moving forward. And I definitely think he has a role. I think just for me, the question is, what kind of role is that? Is, he's obviously going to want it to be a starting level point guard, a starting point guard position. And, with him transitioning to being more of, less of a 20-point per game scorer, more of a ball handler, a guy who's setting other people up with some of his defensive limitations. Like, I think he can still be effective. I just think the question is, are teams going to look at him as a starting level point guard, where if you're not going to be that guy who's putting up numbers in, certain ways offensively, they might be looking for a little bit more defense. I just think there's a lot of factors in whether they view him as that starting level guy versus a bench piece, which kind of the push and pull the Lakers were going through, is obviously going to factor into how these teams are valuing him in free agency and how much of that $14 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception these teams would be willing to use on him this coming off season. So
yeah, it depends on the rosters. I mean, I don't know. You could look at even a team like the Orlando Magic, for example. They have a lot of great. Just in general, they have a great defensive team, but they need some offensive punch.
Yeah.
So it all depends on the rosters of the potential playoff teams, and I know we're far out from it, but certainly D'Lo. Does someone also look at him and say, well, we can really utilize his passing and take his skills and fit him in our team and system and like hone in on those. And, defensively, if you have a good team around him, He still tries to get deflections, but I understand what
I
you mean in general.
I think his
Like,
his defense. I think his defense has actually been much better since he got to the Nets compared to
yeah,
what it has been throughout his career. But he's viewed, I think, a certain way defensively. Just in terms of his overall player archetype. And as you said, that could work on a team maybe that's lacking scoring, but where you could insulate him with a bunch of really good defenders. The Magic obviously are a good example there. So I just think that at this point in his career, I think that the changing role obviously could impact the way that some of these teams are valuing him in free agency. Now, as it pertains to the Nets and a potential deal of him coming back here, you look at his last contract, it was 2 years, $36 million with a player option in the second year. As you said, if I'm projecting what the Nets are going to give him, I think it's a short-term deal, a 1+1. I would think with no other teams having cap space, if D'Lo wants to get, his money and he wants to get a few dollars above that non-taxpayer mid-level exception, and the Nets are the only team that are able to give it to him, they should have leverage in that regard. So could it be a 1+1 with the team option in the second year? Something similar to his last contract. As I said, 2 years, $36 million, 2 years, $30 million, like whatever. That seemed like the framework of what a deal would look like if he were to come back to the Nets. And if we're talking about the case for it, there's a few factors where it could benefit both parties. For the Nets, if they're looking to make a trade for a big name moving forward, that's another mid-sized contract that you're adding to your books that you can use as a sizable chunk as a salary filler. And to other teams, whether they want D'Lo or whether, they just look at it as an expiring contract that they can add to their books and be able to create cap space and cap flexibility, it should be enticing to them in that regard. He could also potentially be a veteran piece if the team makes a leap towards contention and he's not involved in a trade. Maybe you want him as a lead ball handler, or got kind of like a bridge point guard moving forward. And as you said, they have to use cap space on somebody. They have all this cap space. They can't just, leave it be and not use anything. They could roll it over, but signing D'Lo to, a 1+1 could potentially be that move to roll it over. So when you're looking at the case for it, do you see it as something that makes sense for both sides?
I do. I mean, to me, I look at it as, again, depending on where they finish in the lottery and the draft, there's a case to be made that D'Lo's been a former very high lottery pick. Could he have some insight and wisdom to share with a younger player? Yeah, there's a possibility. And it's like, if he's going to play a decent amount in the beginning and let a younger point guard kind of develop behind them, there's also that case to be made. Because a lot of times point guards take a little bit of time to develop and get their footing in the league. For example, we've seen that with Scoot Henderson with the Portland Trailblazers, who's played better of late, but it's taken a little bit of time. And he's a young guy. It's hard when you're a young kid coming out of college trying to lead and command the locker room of NBA veterans and grown men, quite frankly. It takes a little bit of time. So you touched on a little bit, and I did it as well earlier, about the financial flexibility for the Nets. Looking ahead, you need contracts if you're going to flip for a star or a player looking ahead. And big picture, like I said, you also have a lot of cap space, but you may not be able to just sign guys. It may not be advantageous for them to do that. Even if they take in salaries looking ahead for future draft picks and use the cap space that way, it all depends. They would have an opportunity to keep him no matter what, and he wants to stay here ideally, which is the biggest factor. Ultimately, the landscape is going to take time to shape itself, and we'll circle back on this conversation in a few months after the lottery, I would say. But half the battle is the player wanting to stay, and there's no question that D'Angelo Russell is more than open to staying here and would like to, ideally.
Yeah, and we outlined obviously before the reason for that, and it's, there's some dollar signs obviously involved with that. And just closing out the case for it, I mean, if you look at literally the deal that D'Angelo just got from the Lakers, as I said, 2 years, $36 million, player option in the second year. When D'Angelo signed that contract with the Lakers, the prevailing sentiment amongst, people who cover the NBA was they're giving him this money. He was happy to take it because it's a sizable contract, and he's going to be a guy who they could use to flip, that mid-side salary for another for another impact player, moving forward who might better fit their roster. And it seems like he knew that that was the case. He obviously, he might have wanted to stay in LA, but like he was willing to take that deal, take the money with the understanding that that could be the likeliest outcome. And that could be the same situation that he's coming into with the Nets, where if they give him a 1+1 at, whatever, say 18 million a year, like the last contract he got, he could be trending towards a direction where he's another piece used in a trade. And, that might not be the case. They could always look to keep him, but I think that that's the biggest benefit, is having that mid-sized salary on the books that could be a chunk of cap space in a, as a salary filler in a deal for a bigger name. Now, getting into the case against it, there's several factors that we'll get into, and I want to touch on them one at a time. The first one that comes to my mind is just D'Lo hurting the tank next year. If the Nets do want to tank again next year, or if they want to more aggressively tank than they have been this year, because you look at next year's draft, you got guys like Darren Peterson, AJ DeMonsta, Cam Boozer. People think the top of that draft is far better than the top of this one, which people are already raving about. So if the Nets want to go for a more aggressive tank next year, I mean, is D'Angelo Russell like an all-world, all-NBA point guard at this point in his career? No, but I think it's been pretty clear since he's come in that he's had an impact on winning. And if you're just a box score watcher, you might not think so. Like if we're looking at his numbers, he's at 13.8 points. He's shooting 39% from the field, 32% from three, 5.7 assists to 2.1 turnovers. But I just tweeted this out before we did this pod because I was doing research, and D'Lo's posted a plus 14 net rating swing this season with the Nets, which means the Nets are winning his minutes by 14 points per 100 possessions. That's the best mark among all NBA point guards to play over 500 minutes this season. It's the seventh highest among all players to play for over 500 minutes. And then in games that D'Lo's played over 20 minutes, the Nets are 9-9. So when he's been on the floor and been playing and not injured, he's impacted winning. And if you're a Nets team that next year is trying to tank for a guy like a Darren Peterson, AD DeBonsta, Cam Boozer, as he has this year, he could negatively impact that. So, Scotto, just what are your opinions on that?
Well, I certainly think he's like an adult in the room when he's on the court. He's an extension of Jordy in terms of trying to relay his message. He's harped on that, as he did in my interview with him, about trying to carry over the coach's message onto the court. I think that case that you mentioned about his net rating could also be of interest to teams around the league, because if he's doing that on a team that's a high projected lottery team, it could have a positive impact on a playoff team as well with a net rating per the 100 possessions, as you mentioned. So if you're the Nets and you're making the case or asking me why maybe they wouldn't, I think it also depends, too, if they get a young point guard in the draft. Let's say, for example, they get Dylan Harper, right? If you get Dylan Harper and you just want to force feed him minutes to, hasten his development, well, then, if you're going to play a kid 30-something minutes a night, maybe then that changes the optics of whether D'Angelo Russell would want to come back or not. Still a lot to be determined, but that would be one of the factors of maybe D'Angelo Russell and the Nets don't have a reunion in the summer, is if they end up drafting a point guard high and they move up in the lottery and it's someone such as Dylan Harper.
Yeah, and I think if you look at a way, the Nets could make a swing this summer, but if you're looking at a way that they potentially could organically, tank and bottom out and have a shot at a top draft pick next season, they have 4 first-round picks this year. Just bringing in those guys and letting those guys play with the roster that you have around them, especially if they move on from a veteran like Cam Johnson, they're naturally going to lose a lot of games. I think that the push and pull, as you said, is D'Angelo being an extension of Jordy. A lot of these tanking teams, especially when you're bringing in 4 rookies like that, you don't want to just throw them into the fire with no structure whatsoever and have it just be complete anarchy. So while D'Angelo might help you win a few more games than you want, he also provides that structure for those players, those younger guys, mentorship, leadership, professional guy, as the Nets have spoken about Cam Johnson when they didn't trade him at the deadline. They like those things about him. So it's kind of how much are you valuing that and those stabilizing presences. versus how much are you putting a premium on maximizing the draft pick, right?
I'll give you a caveat. I don't think they're bringing in 4 first-round picks.
Yeah, that's a very real possibility.
I think some of those picks are either getting moved for future first-round picks down the line, or we'll see if they move up. But I will make a prediction. I don't think the Nets are going to have 4 first-round picks all coming onto their roster next season. Just a prediction for now.
Okay. Food for thought. Everybody mark that down from Scotto. But regardless, they'll have multiple they'll have at least 2, it seems like. They'll have multiple rookies coming in, one of which who is going to be a really high draft pick, who you're going to want to have some guys at least to show the ropes of how things are done. So the idea of them just getting rid of all of the veterans like D'Lo, Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, all these guys, and just throwing these young guys into the fire, I think it's safe to say there'll be a few veterans on the Nets roster next year.
There has to be. You always have to help develop young players with good veteran role models. And I touched on it a little earlier with you, but D'Lo was a high pick for the Lakers, saw the highs and lows of that. There's a case to be made that he would have some pretty good wisdom to share with someone like a Dylan Harper, for example, and how the different experiences he's had in other places outside of Brooklyn shaped him. And, time will tell, but something to keep in the back of your mind.
Definitely. So first con I said of bringing D'Lo back would be him hurting the tank because he has impacted winning this year. Another one is just other ways that they would be able to use that cap space that they're using on him if they didn't bring him back. And that can be several things. I think you said it earlier. They could look to, take on salary dumps from other teams in return for draft picks. Yeah. So use that cap space on D'Lo. That's a sizable chunk likely that's off the table. They could potentially also want to use that space on a free agent, whether that's, a restricted free agent. You talk about guys like Santi Aldama, Josh Giddey, Jonathan Kuminga, some of these guys that could hit the market. Some UFAs like I think Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, guys that could make sense for them. And you also, we said the Nets lead the league's 55 to 65 million in cap space. They have to bring back guys like Cam Thomas, Day'Ron Sharpe, Zaire Williams. I mean, they don't have to, but if they're going to, they're going to have to use, chunks of that cap space to do that. So there's an opportunity cost, obviously, of re-signing D'Lo of some of those things that you'd be able to do otherwise, with that chunk of cap space.
Yeah. What's funny? You talk about what could hurt a tank for the Nets. You know who's the biggest deterrent to that? Jordy Fernandez. Because he's overachieved, and I'm telling you right now, Jordy Fernandez this season has proven to be one of the better coaches in the NBA. I promise you, Erik, before the season, people did not expect the Nets to win this many games thus far. Many people thought the Nets were going to be arguably up there probably with the Wizards as one of the worst teams in the NBA. And I think it says something that Jordy Fernandez has squeezed the orange and gotten all the pulp that he could out of the Brooklyn Nets team this year. There's something to be said for that. And the foundation he and Sean Marks and the Nets are trying to lay going forward. And one thing's for sure, you talk about the D'Lo is going to be back, Cam Thomas. Jordy Fernandez is going to be here for a while. This guy has proven to be a very good coach. And I do get a kick when he's on the sidelines, how he argues with the refs and he says, I'm fighting for my life. That
was in the Olympic doc, right? The Court of Gold or whatever. I saw that was funny. I saw that. A lot of Nets fans, if you haven't seen that, go watch. I think it's called Court of Gold on Netflix. A lot of Jordy access with Team Canada from the Olympic.
Had a lot of stars on that Canadian national team too.
Yeah, for sure.
And he coached them well.
And if Jordy's definitely been a deterrent of the tank in terms of just what he's been able to get out of these guys in terms of how hard they're playing. I mean, if you're talking about teams, there are hustle stats, obviously, that you can measure this with, but just teams that play hard almost every night, the Nets have to be up there, at the top of those rankings. And it's obvious because a lot of teams come in and they think that they're going to coast to wins, whether it be, the Thunder or the Lakers or, the Cavs in this recent game. And then before they blink and the Nets are up 15, 20 points on them. And that's happened, numerous times this season. Now then the Nets will also go out and lose to the Washington Wizards, and that's just the rhyme and the reason and the lack thereof of their season this year. But before we close it out with little, prediction on what we think will happen with D'Lo, just on that subject line, I mean, like you said, I mean, the Nets 19.5 win projection this year. Nobody thought that they were going to, win this many games, and that's led to, it seems like, quite a few Nets fans maybe ripping some hair out of their head in frustration as they, have stacked some of these wins and their draft odds have continued to tumble. They're kind of hanging around right now. I touched on this in the open, but they're hanging around, they're tied with the 76ers for 5th after the 76ers lost to the Raptors last night, which was just like the Tankapalooza of all tank-offs. That kid, you see the injury report for that game? Oh, my God. I mean, like, the NBA the NBA's fining the Jazz, $100,000 for the player participation policy. It's like maybe glance over at that Toronto Philly game. Like, what are your opinions on that? Because that was just the injury report. The Jazz, I think, are the biggest culprit, but that was a pretty ridiculous game last night also.
I mean, you could say the Hornets injury report is pretty brutal too. For all these teams, the reality is what it is. I could see why they're trying to all improve their draft odds. What I will say is, you look at years ago, the Pistons had the worst record, and then they fell. And then you had the Hawks, who I believe it was the 10th worst record in the league, and then they vaulted to number 1. So ultimately, if the Nets move up in the lottery and they land somewhere in that top 3, I think fans will breathe a sigh of relief. Erik, I'd also point out that once you get out of that top 3, there's still pretty good players on that board. Like me personally, I'm a big Trey Johnson guy. I think.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second? Just
sure.
I posted that D'Angelo net rating stat, and literally a reply just popped up on my phone as you were talking, and it's from a Nets fan, and they, excuse my cursing, they said, "Stupid fucking trade. This season is going to drive me effing insane." So that gives you a glimpse into how Nets fans are feeling about the them winning a few of these games and D'Lo potentially impacting it. But you were talking.
Don't worry, I see it. I see it from time to time.
You were speaking about Trey Johnson. My bad. Go on.
No, I like everybody was fixated on the top 3 with Cooper Flagg, Dylan Harper, Amari Bailey for no, I'm sorry, not Amari Bailey, Ace Bailey. Ace
Bailey, yeah. Amari Bailey is in Long Island right now.
I'm, as you can tell, I'm somewhere along the line. I always have my Nets thoughts in my mind. But as far as after those top 3, like I like Trey Johnson. I think he's a guy that can fill up the stat sheet in terms of his scoring, shooting the ball. He's got a clear NBA skill. You got from BYU, VJ Edgecombe. You got a ton of guys. Nolan Traore was considered a top pick coming into the year. He's fallen off a little bit in the eyes of some execs, but there's talent there. There is.
Yeah.
And the one thing the Nets showed previously when they had picks in the late teens and even the early 20s when they found Karis LeVert and Jared, they can find talent. So we'll see where the lottery odds shake up. I would love to see what they do with a top pick because they've never really been in that position in a long time. So to be determined.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, like Scotto, this is, and I'm not accusing you of this, but this is the line of thinking. Like, yes, there's talent throughout the draft. The Nets have been good at drafting. I mean, Sean Marks has never picked higher than 20th, and he's gotten several impact players in those late draft picks. But as you just said at the end, the Nets have not had a lottery pick since 2010 when they took Derek Favors 3rd overall, and they missed out on John Wall in that draft. And they haven't had a homegrown superstar in really the franchise's history ever. They've never had one. I mean, we're talking Kenyon Martin, we're talking Brooke Lopez, like we're talking about these guys that they took. I mean, Derek Coleman, if you want to go further back, but like guys were all good players, not a superstar. Yeah. I think that's where the frustration lies in with some of the fans, and I understand it. I mean, are there good players? Like, I think I spoke about this on a recent episode, but I think it's very doom and gloom. Like the fans that are frustrated about it, like, this is a disaster. How can you do this? And the other fans are like, hey, we have 4 first-round picks. We lead the NBA in first-round picks. We have the most cap space in the league. We have a desirable market. Like, it's not so bad. So
see, See, Erik, everybody talked about for years how Sam Presti was hoarding all these first round picks and looking ahead towards the future. And Sean Marks said, "Hold my beer. I'm gonna get a few.
Yeah,
hold
but
my beer, mate."
Sam Presti, hold my beer, mate. You just said. But Sam Presti also had a pretty egregious tanking season that ended with them getting Chet Holmgren in the second overall pick. So
Yeah,
I'm just saying I've understood it. Like some of what they've like, I think a lot of what they've done this year hasn't made sense in terms of how they've managed the tank. But we're
yeah,
up to this point in the season, and we're talking about the Jazz, and more importantly for the Nets, the Raptors and the 76ers and some of what they're doing. I mean, the Raptors had a game against the Orlando Magic last week where they were winning and they pulled all 4 or 5 of their starters in, the last 6 minutes of the game, and they still won on a miracle 3. But that gives you a sense into what they're doing.
yeah.
You have the 76ers. Nick Nurse is saying we're, Gershon Yabusele, Kelly Oubre, Quentin Grimes are going to have their minutes monitored moving forward. They already shut down Joel Embiid. Like all of these teams are taking these tanking measures, and the Nets aren't doing it. And at this point in the season where they're not getting in the play-in, there's 18, 17 games left. I don't see what, the reason is not to take some of these steps, because they're either going to finish 5th, 6th, or 7th right now.
Yeah.
And if they're going to beat out the 76ers, who would, literally are going to do everything possible to keep that pick they owe top 6 protected to OKC, they're going to have to take some of these steps if they want to stay ahead of those teams, or even a team like the Raptors. But like, just what is your opinion on that? Because I just, them not doing it up to this point, like when we're at this point in the season now where it's really like just tanking time for a lot of these teams, the Nets have seemed like they're not going to do it. And some fans might be happy with that. A lot aren't. But to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense, when you're weighing the potential benefit of getting up to, say, that number 5 spot.
Well, we're going to see if the basketball gods reward effort, because the Nets have given effort. We'll see.
Some fans think that the ethical tank is what I've said. Some fans like to call it, that they believe in that positive karma and that the Nets will be rewarded for that.
We'll see. They've played hard. They've won some games that nobody in their right mind thought they had a business in winning, and then they've lost some heartbreakers. But a lot of the losses the Nets have had have been within a couple of points. They're not getting smoked or blown out at all, which also says something about Jordy and the effort he's getting from these guys. And truthfully, the players on the roster want to make a case that, hey, I can be a future member of this team. You think Cam Thomas is going out there trying to lose games in a free agent year? No.
Yeah, no.
Like, he's not. Zaire, new contract. He wants to get paid. I get it. The players aren't going to be out here trying to tank. It would be on the organization to pull these guys, monitor their limits and whatnot. We haven't seen it to this point yet. We'll see what happens down the stretch. It's going to be an exciting finish towards the lottery standings. And big picture for the Nets, looking ahead, it's going to be an exciting offseason. There's a lot of flexibility that they have going forward, and I'm curious to see how they use it.
Before we close this out with just predictions, we strayed a little bit away from D'Lo, but predictions on what he's going to do. Who do you think were the Toronto Raptors' leading scorers last night in that game? And if you get it, I will be extremely impressed with you.
Wait, I might know this. AJ Lawson, maybe?
He led the Raptors in scoring, who was on the Long Island Nets earlier this season. Scotto, see, that's why you get paid the big bucks, man, because you could pull stuff like that out of your head. And if you get the next 2, I will be extremely impressed.
Is Colin Castleton up there?
No, he had 7 points on 3 of 8 shooting.
He started. He had his first start last night.
He started, yeah, so not a bad guess. But
Jamal Shed?
No.
No, he didn't play. Jeez.
I'll give it. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it was Jared Roden, who was a Seton Hall product,
a local guy, by the way.
Yeah, went to high school in the Bronx.
Just got the 2-way there. Yep.
Yeah, and then the other one was Orlando Robinson, who I think a lot of people remember.
Got converted to a standard deal. Yeah. Actually reported on these guys.
Yeah, so you know this stuff. That's why I asked you. I was like, Scotto's got his finger on this pulse. You know what I mean?
That is, yeah, that's a pulse. That's a faint beating.
Yeah. All right, closing this out. Predictions on what we think is going to happen. Scotto, will D'Lo be back in the black and white next season in Brooklyn? What do you think?
Oh, you're circling back with me after the lottery, because I can give you an honest answer. I'm not having somebody clip this down like, oh, you said. We're
all right. Well,
and I want to see. What I love too about our group is like when we're in the media room, we're chopping it up. You, me, Brian Lewis, CJ Holmes, everybody, the Nets Daily guys, and having fun about it for sure.
Yeah, we'll circle back. I personally, not a hard prediction, but I'll say I would not at all be surprised if D'Lo was back on what I laid out in terms of just like a 1+1 deal. I think it has benefits to both sides. But as Scotto said, lottery. You
want some sprinkles on that vanilla cone? Yeah. Yeah. See, I'm telling you, you got to wait a few months. Once we know the lottery, like we can go a little more deep dive and more aggressive on it. But it'd be like nothing you say now matters because the lottery could change everything.
Yeah. All that matters is there's a rhyme or reason, a logic where it could make sense for both sides. We got to wait on the lottery. We got to wait on free agency. We got to wait to see if there's teams looking to salary dump potential guys. So Scotto and I will circle back. We'll have more coverage of all that down the line. You guys can find all of his stuff on HoopsHype. Great reporting there. You guys should all go check out the interview he did with D'Lo and all the other work that he's doing. And Scott, I appreciate you coming on as always. This might be your 4th or 5th appearance. I think you're on the leaderboard in terms of Believe in Nets appearances. You might be at the top up there. It's you and B. Lewis are neck and neck right now. So towards the end of the season, we'll have to circle back and maybe put you in the lead. But I appreciate you taking the time, man. And I'm sure I'll see you at Barclays this weekend.
Anytime. Looking forward to it. And we know who's number one in your hearts and the fans of the Nets.
Yes, sir, man. See ya. That does it for this episode of Believe in Nets on the Believe Podcast Network, your one-stop shop for everything happening across the sports and entertainment world. Hope you guys enjoyed the talk with Scotto. I think we touched on a lot of really great things there. As I said at the top, if you do not already, go to my YouTube channel at Erik Slater NBA. Subscribe if you do not like this. Comment. Anything you guys can do to engage is much appreciated. You guys can find all my work on ClutchPoints.com. You could also follow me on Twitter at Erik Slater _. Constant news updates, analysis, live game tweets, press conference clips, injuries updates, all that. But we're approaching the stretch run to close the season. The tank race is heating up. We're potentially going to get some more talk about potential free agents and how some of those guys are viewing the situations, how the Nets might be viewing the situation. So I'll have coverage of all that and more here on Believe in Nets. Talk to you guys soon.